Good evening, everyone. My name is Irene, and I am going to present to you all a small PPT on the various React states and how the states can be managed and the different types of states. So, this PPT consists of three main parts. The first one will talk about what is a React state and what are the ways of creating a state, how to use it, and how to access it, followed by the different types of states. There's a total of 5 states. And then finally, we'll go to state management. So, what is a React state? States are like the heart of React applications. They are the memory of your components. They allocate memory, and all your properties are stored in your React states. It allows them to remember things over time and react to changes. So, for example, let's say you're building a shopping cart for an e commerce website. So, the number of items in your cart changes as user adds or removes products. Similarly, the total price updates automatically based on whatever action you performed. And then you have form inputs that let users fill in their shipping details. How does React keep track of all these changes? That's where state comes in. So we perform these following functions with the state. The first one is creating a state object and then using state objects, and followed by changing or updating a particular state object. So this slide is basically to understand how to work with React State. It's a powerful feature for managing dynamic data and applications. State is essentially a JavaScript object that is used to hold information about a component. It determines how the component behaves and what it displays. So first one, creating the state object. To create a state object, we define it in the constructor method of a class-based component. State can have multiple properties and it can be accessed using the this keyword. So basically, in creating a state object, you initialize the state and set up the component's data structure. It's like preparing a container to store your data. Then we have how to use the state object. Once the state is created, we use it in the render method. A render method consists your JavaScript JSX element, which is basically what appears in your UI. So the syntax for accessing a property in the state is this.state.your property name. This means React retrieves the data stored in the state and updates the user interface accordingly. Every time the state changes, your UI gets updated or re-rendered automatically. Okay, this is important because this allows your component to reflect the latest state values, ensuring that the UI is always in sync with the data. Finally, you have changing state object. When the data and the state changes, React provides this method ensures that the component re-renders with the updated state so that the UI remains consistent and responsive. Instead of modifying the state directly, we use set state because React needs to know when changes occur to efficiently update the UI. So, a summary for this particular slide. Creating the state object initializes the data. Using the state object allows us to display dynamic data in the UI. Changing the state object ensures our application responds to user interactions or changes. React state mechanism ensures that applications are interactive, dynamic, and always in sync with user actions. So this is a program to show you how state is used. So you have a class component here, which is your class car. Here you are initializing the this dot state, which is basically creating your state. This state has four properties here, which is the brand, model, color, and the year. This dot set state is you setting and initializing initialized value for your state. So the default state for your color value is blue. Now in the JSX part, which is in the return statement of render, you are accessing a particular property using this dot state dot. Moving on, we have the various type of states. So there are 5 different types of states. We'll go one by one. So the first one, you have local state. Local state refers to state variables that belong to a single component. They are created using useState or keyword or hook. So for example, your form input fields, counters, toggling a drop-down list, all those come under your local state. Local state is usually used when the state is confined to a single component and does not have to be shared. For example, think of a drawer containing your stationery, your pens, pencils, your calculators. The contents of this drawer are specific only to you and are useful only for your tasks. You don't have to share them with others. It mainly belongs to you. Then we have a global state. Global state is shared across multiple components, is used when several components need access to the same data. For example, your user authentication, your theme settings, and so on. So, for example, you can take a company. So, when there's a company policy that's released or updated, it has to be uniform for everyone. So, that policy will be common to all employees of that particular company. Then you have server state. In server state, data is fetched from an external server or an API. It involves fetching, updating, and managing data asynchronously. For example, let's say you have a warehouse and your company is affiliated to the warehouse. You do not own the warehouse, but then every time you need something from the warehouse, you can ask for it or you get it from the warehouse. So that's particularly how it works. Your example, you can also take like an online food delivery. You place an order which can be taken as an API call, wait for your delivery, asynchronous fetch, and then update your app. Then we have then we have derived state. So derived state is calculated from existing state of properties. It does not need to be stored separately because it can be computed on the go. For example, let's say you're calculating the total of a bill. So you do not have to have the total stored because you can just calculate it as and when you have the bill. Or you can take, for example, your electricity bill. You don't store the exact bill amount all month. You calculate it based on how much you use and your power consumed, basically. Then finally, we have the form state. Form state manages input fields and their changes. It tracks values entered by users, validation, and submissions. For example, a login form tracking email and password inputs. It includes error messages in case there's any invalid entries. So how it is used is basically you use useState for smaller forms or third-party libraries like FormMake or etc. for more complex forms. So these are codes for local state. Like I said, local state refers to the state that is specific to a particular single component. It manages internal data like user input, button clicks, toggles, and all these functions do not have to be shared with all the components. So it's usually defined in the constructor using the hooks this.state and this.setState. Then global state. So global state is when data has to be common and the themes or the functions have to be common with multiple components. So then you use third party apps like third party libraries such as Redux, Context API, or Recall, or you can use the hook use context, which helps you generate data based on whatever context it is. So this is a small code snippet for it. Then you have the server state. So when you fetch data from a remote server, like for example, making an API call that's supposed to be used within your React application, then you could use the server state. Your application could be in server state. It is handled using hooks like useEffect for fetching data and use state for accessing the data stored locally in your components. Derived state is basically computed from other states or properties. It is not directly set by the user, but it is like a reaction to something that already happened. It's calculated based on the actions and the data we have, and it's not something that we set on our own. It's usually residing inside the render method, and it is inside a functional component. Functional components basically take properties as the arguments. And then form state, like I told, is used for mainly your forms, for your input fields, for checking if your password and your email is validated, and it has various methods and functions that help you create a seamless efficient form. Finally, we have state management tools. So you have built-in tools such as useState, Reducer, and Context API, as well as you have third-party tools like Low Redux, Movex, and Sustand. So useState and useReducer is basically used for managing local states. useState is used for managing local states with single components, and useReducer is basically used for managing multiple. It's used for managing multiple states of a single component when two or more properties need to have the same state. And then you have Context API, which is linked with the global state of a component. It helps in sharing global data state across components. You have third-party tools, like I said, Low Redux, Movex, and Sustand, which can be used to mimic the behavior of the built-in tools, but in a more efficient way. For example, we have the useState code. Here, the useState hook is used to create a stable state variable count, and its updater function is setCount. The value of count is shown in the UI, and the setCount function updates the value of count when buttons are clicked, based on because onClick is your event name. So in the useReducer code, the reducer function takes the current state and an action and returns the new state. The action types describe what the action will do, for example, increment or decrement. And the use reducer hook manages state logic, similar to use state, but better for more complex state logic. State.count holds the current value, and dispatching actions include sending an action to the reducer to update state. Context API, basically, it's used when you want to let multiple components have the same theme. So in case of, let's say you want to make like a elaborate app, and every app page has to have the same theme, so then you can think of it as a global state. So then you could use theme context, and then you can create a context API management state. And then third party apps like Redux Store centralize the state that can be accessed in any component. Objects with type describe changes, example increment, and dispatch as an action to update the state. So this has been my presentation on states of React. I hope you'll understood, and thank you so much for listening. Have a happy new year.